Guys, we're back for lesson 23, which is explore various accounts of migrant life. So today what we're going to do is we are actually going to look at multiple sources in order to explore what migrant life was like during this particular time of the Dust Bowl. We're going to look at poetry, informational text, photography, and although it says an audio interview, I'm going to read you what the audio would have said, but basically what you need to get from that is that it's someone else's account, like an eyewitness or a personal primary source account of a description of what it was like to work in migrant camps or in the migrant life. So let's talk first of all what a migrant is. We've talked about immigrant, right? So immigrants are those who come to our country from other countries, right? So migrant is somebody who migrates across a country or our country. In this particular case, we're talking about those people who migrate from place to place, most likely for work, for jobs, especially during this particular time in U.S. history, right? The Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, all of that. So when we are talking about migrant life, we're talking about a look in the life of a migrant worker and their families and what it was like for their families. So we are going to take a look at these 4 different sources today. So what you're going to need is everything that I have. You have your novel, you have your purple notebook, and then within your novel, we are going to be using page 32, which is an article that is titled Okies, and that is from the livinghistoryfarm.org. It is a web-based article. And then we are going to be looking at a photograph that the photograph itself is on page 33. The article is 32. The photograph is on page 33 in your purple notebook. But we are also going to be looking at it on the screen. So don't worry about how grainy and awful it looks. You won't be able to get an idea looking on the page 33. But what I would like you to use that page for is to take notes about the photography as we dig into it. And then, of course, your reading log as well. So when we get to the reading log, we can talk about setting that up, but we are in lesson 23 today. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to reread Migrants. Now, Migrants was one of the poems that we read, and this is going to be the first thing that we're going to look at. This is the poetry-based text that we're going to look at to discover or identify or discuss what it was like to be a migrant or what it was like in the life of a migrant. So in your reading log, you're going to answer 2 questions. This is the first thing that you will do in your reading log for lesson 23. So if you need to stop the video or the recording at this point to go ahead and set your reading log up, do that. Go ahead and title it lesson 23. And then in that, what you want to go ahead and do is write these 2 questions. What does this poem tell us about people who leave the Dust Bowl? And then how would you describe the tone of this poem? Now, tone and mood, we've done all this, so that should be fairly easy to you. So what I want you to do now is just go ahead and stop this particular recording. I want you to reread Migrants, and I want you to answer those 2 questions in your log, okay? And whenever you hit play again, we will just keep right on going. All right, so you have reread Migrants, and some of the questions that I want you to ask yourself about this particular, and these are just discussion questions, questions to think about more than anything in order for us to dig into the poem a little bit here. What do they take with them when they leave? What do they say to the people? What do they say to the people they are leaving? So what are the things that they actually say to those that they're leaving behind in the Dust Bowl? Where do they go? What do they intend to do when they get there? And then does the speaker in this particular poem, Billy Joe, sound like she believes they will ever come back? And of course, this is all just based off of this poem and this text, okay? So don't start assuming, go directly to the text. And then what is the speaker, or what is Billy Joe, um, what is her tone in this poem? How does she feel? What is the feeling that you get from her in this particular poem? So I want you to just take some time and just go back to the poem and just look at some of those things and see if you can find some text evidence to answer some of these questions to yourself in order for a good, strong discussion here. Okay, so what were some of the thoughts that you had about some of the answers to these questions? I found in the text several things. Some of the things that they would take when they left, it says that they would take everything that they owned, right? And then it actually gets into some very specifics about, it says, setting out with their bed springs and mattresses, their cook stoves and dishes, their kitchen tables and their milk goats tied to their running boards. So they literally took everything that they owned with them. And it, the next part says, what do they say to the people, that they're leaving? Well, we'll be back when the rain comes, right? We'll be back when the rain comes, they say, pulling away with all they own. I don't know. I mean, if you're going to take every single thing that you own, are you really coming back? I'm not sure that I would be completely confident on that, with them taking everything that they owned. And where were they going to be going? It specifically says on page 61, setting out for California. So they're going further west. Why? Why are they going further west? More opportunity there? I think we'll learn a little bit more about that when we dig into some other text. But what does Billy Joe sound like? I mean, does she believe? Does it sound like that she believes that they'll ever come back? I don't know. If you look at the last stanza, it says, "Don't forget us," they say, "but there are so many leaving. How can I remember them all?" I don't know. I don't know if it sounds like that. I've got some of these answers down here that I thought that you might think about. Um, it said that Billy Joe thinks they will stay away if they find somewhere better to live. I can probably agree with that a little bit. If they find a better job, or find any job for that matter, then yeah, that they very well will most likely stay. And then I do feel like here on the bottom where it says that the tone is sad, I agree with that. Or the way that the language is and the way that it's set, they're taking everything that they own. They claim that they're coming back. Yeah, I would definitely agree that the tone, especially in Billy Joe's kind of voice here, definitely feels like that it is sad. It's sad that all these people are leaving. Sad, especially that they're all leaving and she can't, right? Because I really feel like this is kind of setting the stage for what this entire novel is about, right? Getting out of the dust. How does she do that? Mentally, physically? How does she get out of the dust? How does she get out of this particular part of her life, so to speak? All right, so that is poetry, right? So let's look at some informational text. Let's look at page 30 in our purple folders, and you will find that web-based article that is called Okies. All right, and so what I want you to think about in this particular article is I want you to think about how the information has changed your understanding of migrant life. So we've had a lot of information about how Billy Joe and the people are actually living on the Dust Bowl, but then we have just a little bit of insight into migrant life in this poem, right? The fact that they pick up and they leave the Dust Bowl. But Okies gets into a little bit more detailed information, and so I want you to really listen. I'm going to actually read this one to you, but I want you to listen and I want you to think about What surprised you and what information is new to you here that we haven't learned yet in the novel with the poetry? And I want you to take notes within the text as you listen to me read. That's why I'm going to read it to you, because you haven't read this yet. And I want you to really kind of dig into the text, and I want you to think about it as I read it, and then take some notes that are answering the questions that you see up here on your screen. How has the information in this article added to or changed your understanding of migrant life? And what surprised you about the migrant life? And what is new information to you about migrant life? So here we go. This is Okies. And we're just going to think about that unraveling process as you are taking notes here. As the double whammy of drought and depression deepened on the Great Plains, more and more farmers gave up or were forced off of their land. In addition, the relentless march of new tractors meant that the farmers who were able to scrape together enough money to buy a tractor could buy out their neighbors. Fewer farmers could farm more land. But where would those who are left go? So something that I just noticed in this very first paragraph, I want to stop and just take a mental note here, is something here that those who could afford the newer tractors were then able to buy their neighbor's land. So I didn't realize that they were buying their neighbors out. So that's new information to me. Some went to cities, but many decided to head west. In fact, during the 30s, hundreds of thousands left the plains for the west coast. So many migrated from Oklahoma that they were dubbed Okies in the popular press. So that's why the title of this particular article is Okies. For years, California, Oregon, and Washington had been growing. Many who were pushed off of the plains were pulled west because they had relatives who had moved to the coastal areas. And the boosters of California had advertised that the state offered a perfect climate and an abundance of work in the agricultural industry. So agricultural industries, that's farming, right? Agriculture. So now all of a sudden California is offering great climate. No dust storms there, right? Come out here and farm. Florence Thompson, who's in the picture above, says she was one of the Okies. She and her family had left Oklahoma in 1925 before the Depression. The 30s made their situation worse. She and the family were following the migrant trail, moving from place to place as crops became ready for harvest. It was very hard and cheap, Florence said. We just existed. We survived. Let's put it that way. California, the state that had once advertised for more migrant workers, found themselves overwhelmed by up to 7,000 new migrants a month, more migrants than they needed. So for several months in 1936, the Los Angeles Police Department sent 136 deputies to the state line to turn back migrants who didn't have any money. Bordering states like Arizona were angry that California was trying to dump hobos back on them. Eventually, the police returned to Los Angeles, but the migrants kept coming. There was some work, especially in the new fields of cotton that were being planted in California, a crop that Southern Plains people knew a lot about. But there was not enough work for everyone who came. Instead of immediate riches, they often found squalor in roadside ditches, encampments. The plight of the Okies and other plains migrants caught the sympathy of people across the country. In part, this was because these migrants were white, in contrast to the Mexican and Filipino workers who supplied the factory farms with the seasonal labor needed before and after Okies arrived. The Okies also came in family groups and were in desperate straits, living in tents or out of the back of a car or truck. Photographs were taken of the migrants from the Great Plains and published around the world. John Steinbeck visited a migrant camp in California and wrote a magnificent piece of fiction, The Grapes of Wrath, which still sells millions of copies today. Florence Thompson says she and many others lived the life that Steinbeck dramatized. Their story is part of a larger story of migration into and out of the plains during the 30s. This particular article was written by Bill Genzel of the Genzel Group, first written and published in 2003. So, taking a look at the text, what surprised you about the text? I know that I pointed out something new that I had learned there, but what information was new to you in this particular text, and what surprised you in this text? Some of the things that I underlined as I read through it was that there were over 7,000 new migrants a month trying to come into California. That's a lot. And so California did try to stop them. It didn't last very long, but they did try to stop them from coming in. But really, what I think sticks out as far as new information, something that we may not have learned yet from our novel, because remember, our novel has been based on Billie Joe and her family staying within the Oklahoma Panhandle there, that Dust Bowl area, is now we have a look into how the migrants were actually living. Now, in one of the poems, it did note, it did talk about how bad people were living in the Dust Bowl, and specifically talked about how some kids were being taken away from their families, and how bad that they were living, how families would leave their children. You know, it talked about the baby being left on the doorstep of the church, I believe is what it was. So this gave us, it specifically, if I'm going to cite some text evidence here, it says, hold on, I'm just trying to find the actual paragraph here, where they were living in ditches and out of the backs of their cars. So they were not living well at all. It actually even uses the word squalor. Squalor. It says a crop that Southern Plains people knew a lot about, but there was not enough work for everyone who came. Instead of immediate riches, they often found squalor in roadside ditch encampments. Okay, so that should give you a little bit more insight into the migrant life. This is this is one of the photographs that we're taking a look at today. The photography. This is the Migrant Mother that I told you about, that is on page 33. So take some notes as you're analyzing this photograph. And I want you to look closely for anything that, again, surprises you, adds to what you know, or maybe even contradicts your understanding of migrant life. Specifically, this photograph is titled Migrant Mother. Why do you think that is? These are all questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to analyze the photograph, just the same way that we analyzed the informational text. Just kind of giving you some time to really look at that before I move on. If you need to stop it in order to get a real good look, please stop the recording, and then when you're ready to pick up and move on, then just hit play again. So here's the audio interview. This is a description that was written from or verbalized, I should say. It was an interview that took place of the photographer of the photograph that you just viewed. The Dorothea Lange is the photographer, and this is what the photographer has been recorded to say about that. The photograph that has become known as Migrant Mother is one of a series of photographs that Dorothea Lange made of Florence Owens Thompson and her children in February or March of 1936 in Nipomo, California. Lang was concluding a month's trip photographing migratory family farm labor around the state for what was then the Resettlement Administration. In 1960, Lang gave this account of the experience. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother, as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her who helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. Okay, so what are some of the things that surprised you here? What are some of the things that you didn't know? She seems pretty young, right? 32. She has, from the photograph that we looked at just briefly a minute ago, a couple of children. Something that surprises me is she sold the tires off of her car to buy food. I don't know if many of us have ever quite been in that particular situation before, where you felt the desperate need to sell something that could potentially, it's transportation, right? Most of us have cars. Most of us, use them without even thinking about, the importance or non-importance of them. I thought that was pretty telling of what it was like to be a migrant during that particular time. All right, so here's another picture. This one is a little further out. It's a little bit different. It's the same migrant mother, the same children. You see that there's a younger child here. Really take a look at some of these. You've got a stick that's holding up this tent portion that they're talking about that she's living out of right now. It's called a lean-to tent. Yet pulled out just a little bit further. Sometimes we get the idea that migrant life is really just about moving from place to place in order to work, and that, things are okay because you're moving to work, right? Rather than away from. Don't know. Now here is a really pulled back picture. Really take a look at how they're living. Some of the things that I see is a trunk of clothes. When I say trunk, you see it's the kind of like the box with the hinge closing. This is what they call the lean-to tent, and I'm sure that you can see why. All right, so that is the end of analyzing those 4 different pieces of information or sources of information. We had our poem, and we have had our informational text, the article, and we have had our photographs, and then that first-hand witness interview account from the photographer herself. So now is your assignment. Imagine that you are a migrant who has left the Dust Bowl. Write a letter home to someone you left behind describing some of your experiences as a migrant. I want you to include details from your notes, so the notes that you took on your photograph, the notes that you took in your text, and if you took any notes on within your copy of the novel, if you took notes on that, I want you to use those details to describe your experience as a migrant moving potentially from the Dust Bowl out towards California or into California to work. That is going to be your assignment today. That is what you'll do in your reading log as well as on the forms. So you'll want to look for the link below for the forms link for you to submit your responses. So today in lesson 23, you examined migrant life from 4 different sources. You also wrote a letter to describe migrant life.